and start the meeting. We have welcome to all those present and all those who may or may not be watching us or watching the recording of this meeting. I'll ask our Mayor to open the meeting with a karakia.
Kia ora tātou, whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina ki uta, ki mā taratara ki tai, e hi aki ana te atakura, he hio, he huka, he hohu, tihei, mauri ora.
Thank you. Apologies. I have an apology for lateness from Councillor Epiha. Someone like to move that we accept that apology? Mr. Morton, and seconded by the Mayor. All those in favour? Contrary, carried. Conflicts of interest? There being none. Confirmation of the minutes of the last meeting. Moved Mayor, seconded Councillor Miller. Thank you, members. All those in favour? Contrary, carried. The report of the Deputy Electoral Officer, page 7 on the agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The report, in fact, both of the reports on the agenda this morning are really for the information and discussion of the committee. A couple of items that we requested some further information about. So the first of these is the report on the population data. So the information that's provided here is an update on the latest information that has been released by Stats NZ in terms of the data that's publicly available, and gives us an indication of some of the movements in population across the district since previous electoral cycles. These are the 2020 population estimates based on 2018 census data, but updated as estimates by Statistics New Zealand. And on page 8, I suppose, is really one of the most interesting points, where we see the movement in the population numbers for each of our wards across the district. And in particular, note the column at the right-hand side of that top table, where it calculates the percentage difference from that plus or minus 10% quota, which we are required to meet for the equity of representation across the district. And so we can see that both, in fact, Melbourne, Selwyn Central and Ellesmere are all now well outside that plus or minus 10%. In the case of Melbourne and Ellesmere, dropping well below at minus 26 and minus 24 respectively, and Selwyn now, because of the population growth in Selwyn Central, now significantly over that plus or minus 10% figure. And then on pages 9 through 11, there's just some additional analysis which Murray State has prepared for us, showing population growth by ward. There's a table on page 10 which looks at which takes some of our population forecast and looking at where movement is likely to go. Some discussion of the quota and some discussion of the that member to elected member to population ratio on page 11. So for information and discussion, Mr. Chairman.
For discussion, anybody wish to make comment? Discussion on this report.
I guess one of the questions that arises is particularly on page 11 around population per head of elected members, and what is our appropriate level that we think is appropriate for representation. We seem to be about middle of the pack. We sort of Rotorua is up around 7,500 and Southland's down to sort of 3,500. I think looks like 2.5, even under 3. I think we'll look at the gap, and we're sort of stuck at that 6 thing. Is there a rule of thumb, Stephen, nationwide? I mean, particularly when you look at urban councils, they've got a very high representation per person, but the issue that we face is a geographical spread, I suppose, and it's that basis of how do you represent widely sparsely populated areas with low representation. I think when we saw the amalgamation of Banks Peninsula District Council into Christchurch City, there was a special dispensation made for the fact of a sparsely dispersed population, and both the community board and I think the representation is actually significantly under the numbers. Is that a viable option for us to ask for an exemption for our large, wide-sprung areas?
That would be a matter that we would have to take up with the local government commission. I don't think they are particularly inclined to make exemptions unless there's a very strong case. There'll be some interesting discussion just in terms of the next report about the numbers of ratio of population per councillors, and the chairman might want to make some reflection on some of those discussions. But you are right, we are about middle of the pack, but there is quite a range of ratios of elected members across the country, but certainly some that have a lower number of elected members, so a higher proportion of population per elected member seems to work well across a number of jurisdictions, and that's some of the comments that we've had from a couple of the councils that we've spoken to so far.
Yeah, and in this table, we are presenting councillors of a similar size and a similar ratio. There are other examples throughout the country of higher and lower, and that's one of the questions we have to turn our minds to in the new year once we get mesh block information and we're able to start looking at the options of representation. Is what is the appropriate number? We in the previous table with the ward population growths shows us that we are, as you indicate, Grant, a mixture of urban and rural, and finding a system that adequately represents and fairly represents the mix. I agree with Mr. Hill, and I don't think the Local Government Commission would look favourably on us saying, well, we'll still have two councillors, for example, say in Ellesmere and Malvern, well outside the plus or minus 10%. They may well say that you haven't tried hard enough. That the councils that have those exemptions have real reasons for doing so. ECAN got an exemption for the South Canterbury ward because either way, whether they had one or two councillors, they were going to be well outside the plus or minus 10%. So it is an option. It is an option that our community could ask for and that we could go to the Local Government Commission with. But I'm not sure that it's an option that would be well supported by them. So, as I say, this report really is to give us, and hopefully the community will take these figures back to the community, some starting point to start thinking about how we get the numbers to work. Mr. Morton previously has said, surprisingly, that 7 councillors actually would work out pretty evenly, but that would have a ratio of nearly 10,000 per councillor. So it's food for us to think about.
Sure. I guess my questions are around on page 11. The councils are there because they are of a similar size to us, or because they're a similar ratio to us. And so are there a number of other councils that are similar to us in either geography or size, population, that are outside this ratio?
Unfortunately, Murray State, who prepared the table, is also an apology for today's meeting. He's had an injury this week, so is unable to attend. My understanding is that those are councils that are relatively similar in size, so the range of ratios reflects how they have approached representation.
So even thinking, Mark, as you said, 1 to 10,000 is still nothing compared to Christchurch's ratio with 16 councillors and a few 100,000 people that they're representing. So I'm not particularly stuck on the ratio itself. I think this shows that we're not a big outlier, and I'd rather think about what size of council works well for us to be able to run business. And just wondering if you could remind me of the timeline. When are we going to consider what the options might look like? Is there a workshop space where we're going to be able to throw some things around, or does that all get presented at a meeting just in the new year? How does that play out?
Yeah, so in the new year, towards I think late January or early February, we should have access to the updated mesh block data. So at that point, we'll start to plug that into spreadsheets, and I would imagine we would bring that back to a meeting of the committee, and we could probably, in fact, do some workshop work around looking at options around those numbers and play with the numbers and see what effect that has in terms of the movements of population.
Kia ora, morena koutou, aroha mai, Mr Chair and committee, sorry for being late this morning. If we look at the total numbers of 69,000 to keep us within the plus of 10%, it balances out to about 10 councillors, given the total statistics or population. What would be helpful for me in decision making would be quantifying, and Grant hit it on the head with geography. If we take into New Plymouth District Council into account, I think their geographical spread is about 104 kilometres squared. I think I've looked at it, but we are 6,500 square kilometres of geography. And if we take into account, what I would like to see is data on the work or the mahi that our councillors put in on the road. And I know that in terms of one of our hardest working councillors, Bob Mugford, he spends an incredible amount of time up and down the country attending community committees. So I think that would be a useful tool for me for making a decision as to actually how much work each of our councillors are putting in over the breadth of the district, because it seems to be obviously making the numbers work, but we're not taking into account the breadth of the district. Thank you.
Yeah, a similar sort of vein, I guess, is that it's a very difficult job for councillors to review their own position. I suppose that's what we are doing. So we need to be open about that. What is the mechanism that we're actually going to get our customers' feedback, our ratepayers' feedback as to how they feel they are being served by our representatives? You know, do they feel they're well represented? Do they think they need more representation than less representation? You know, I think we're in danger of what's in it for me type thinking, which is really what we want to avoid. We want to work out what's best for the Selwyn as a whole. And let's articulate the fear that is not being said, is that we'll end up with a very urban-based council out of Ralston, which won't reflect the desires and wants of our larger constituency. And that may be just a generalisation, and it may not be come to account, but that's the fear, understated fear behind this, is that people are concerned what this means for the larger hinterland of Selwyn, and how do we address that and or relay that fear?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Agreeing to everything that Grant has said, but there's a couple of things we probably need to remember, and we started off talking about Banks Peninsula. If I drove for 40 minutes on the peninsula, having lived there, there are a number of places I wouldn't get to. If I drove for 40 minutes, say from Darfield, for example, there's not much of the ward that I wouldn't have actually got to. There's, you know, the speed or the accessibility is different. Also, the level of communication with the increased improvement in fibre optic communication, the whole thing means that as an elected member, you are able to be a lot better connected. Now, I'm not down crying or putting aside the one-to-one, you know, interaction. That's obviously very important, but I think it's more a case of the ability for members of your community to actually connect to their elected member in some form of thing. So it is changing to what it is. And then when you look at a ward, if you've got well, let's use the Melbourne ward. If you've got a couple or 2,500 living in Darfield out of your 7 or 8 or 9, you've got a big group there that are actually quite close. You know, you can actually connect to them on quite an easy basis if you're at the market or just being in the village or whatever it is. So I think that there are a number of factors just besides number. Number doesn't necessarily, you can't sort of go 8, 9, 10, whatever it is. I agree with Grant that there is a degree of discomfort, there is a degree of uneasiness that the heartland will not be appropriately represented, and I think you know my personal views about that. They take great comfort in having one of their elected members actually living in their community, which makes obviously the support for an alternative besides a ward system something they probably wouldn't support. But so, you know, I don't think 1,000 people or whatever it is neither here nor there really. It's also, that's my view.
Councillor Gallagher, any comments? In response to your comments, Councillor Miller, I think that unfortunately the legislation means we've got to look at ratios based on population, and that means with our urban growth that there are going to be more councillors from the more densely populated areas than the rural, and that's the challenge. I think it's a challenge, will be a challenge for future councillors to continue to be fair representatives of the whole district. At the end of the day, we swear an oath to be district councillors, not ward councillors. And we already see today that people will go to the councillor whom they know or they relate to. I get approached by residents outside my ward, and I'm sure we all do, who for some reason or other choose to contact me rather than another councillor. So it's being known and available to the community. I also have a concern that to make sure the system, whichever system we end up with, enables new residents to be able to stand, that it isn't those who've just got long family links or other community links into the community that are able to stand on council, that those who have come to Selwyn recently are able to offer themselves, their expertise and their knowledge to council. Traditionally, well, we've seen it a lot in Selwyn Central, being the fastest growing ward. We've had the councillors with perhaps the shortest links to Selwyn standing and being elected. Councillor Epihar represents a relatively newcomer to Selwyn on council and brings a fresh perspective, which is great. And that's something I believe we need to be able to encourage in our system, because the mixture of experience and new knowledge is the dynamic that works for Selwyn. So this report just shows us where we're at and the challenge in front of us. And I encourage you, and it comes back in the next report, to continue to take this information out to our communities, to explain to them the journey we're on and why we can't simply say status quo. We managed to make status quo work 6 years ago by transferring a mesh block from Central to Ellesmere. Unfortunately, it's not going to be that simple this time. It's not going to be a mesh block. If we wanted to continue with 4 wards, it's going to be either a significant reduction in councillors or a significant change in our ward structure. And that will be the challenge in front of us in the new year. So I think the call for a workshop is a good idea if we can find time in our busy schedules to schedule one where we perhaps can, particularly if we can dynamically play with the mesh blocks and see what kind of structures we had. 6 years ago, we did that by a series of meetings where the electoral office prepared some maps of what the wards might look like. And some of them were quite fascinating. Some of them were quite bizarre. Ellesmere was shown as going around the lake right up to the Christchurch city boundary, which looked just totally strange. And that's another issue we have to get our heads around. What are our communities of interest and how are they best looked after in the new structure, so that we're not, so that they are well represented, but in a structure that works for the whole of the district. So if there's no more debate, I see John, you've got your speaker on. I think we're just about ready to receive this report. Who was first, Sam or John?
Oh, it's all right. I'm sorry, Mark. I cannot let some of the comments you've just made go past, irrespective of how you set up and end up with what structure does not assist individuals coming out of the woodwork to stand for council. That's a whole completely different challenge.
And I just add around thinking about the future and the change that we make this year. It would be nice if it could stand for a few cycles of this change going by rather than just fiddling. We've fiddled for a while and just moved things around, and we're getting further and further away from what actually works. And the reflection, you might talk about it next, Mark, but around the Ashburton taking the bull by the horns and thinking, well, actually, how does this work for us in 10 years' time? And can this solution actually continue to be so? And they had a drastic drop in the number of representatives to ensure that in 6 years' time they weren't going to have to fiddle with it too much. Well, I thought it was a good forward-thinking way of looking at it.
If that's where I think figure 2 on page 10 is helpful to acknowledge that if we can, in the solution we arrive at, have the larger wards under the 10%, in a deficit position, they're being minus on the percentage, that then gives some leeway going forward as they grow to hopefully still be within the 10% in 6 years' time. So that's a challenge to us to look forward to achieving that, and that will help sustain the system. But I think that figure also shows that we may be unable to arrive at a solution that's going to last longer than 6 years because the district continues to grow unevenly, and that it's just very challenging to arrive at that solution.
Kia ora. My question is around, and we've touched on it a couple of times, our engagement and how we propose to engage with our community on this subject through media, or what is there any?
Similar to the way you engage on your annual plan and your district plan with great difficulty.
I'm thinking of media and
We would use a range of channels. We have talked previously about doing some pre-engagement on this matter, and I think given the issues and the wide-ranging potential for change that there is around the process this time, we have certainly indicated that we would be looking to do pre-engagement relatively early in the process next year, and that's where we can canvass some of these issues of what levels of representation do people feel that they're getting at the moment, where are their communities of interest, and what options might be in people's minds as we look to what's ahead. And then of course there is the formal consultation stage further down the track once we have developed an initial proposal that has to go through a formal consultation process. So definitely 2 stages with pre-engagement early in the process.
thanks.
Just sort of a bit of a reference check that just some of the discussion sort of seems to presuppose that when you talk about discussion of mesh blocks and wards, that we're basing our decision on a ward-based system. So I think we need to be careful that we don't sort of predetermine that might be an outcome. I think if we talk about what Selwyn looks like and the explosive growth we're having and predicted to have, maybe a solution which would actually enable us to develop into the future without the need to have major representation reviews would be election at large, because it wouldn't matter what the population grows to. The governance group stays the same. So I think looking at some of the papers coming up, particularly on the from Ashburton about how they approached it in the review process, they were very careful to say don't get on to one narrow outcome too early in the situation. Have 3 or 4 options that you bring to your community that give them some options for them to decide rather than us predetermining what it might be.
Thank you. We'll discuss that in the next report, because there was some interesting feedback from Napier, who went from an election at large to an election by wards, and some of their feedback. So if there are no further debate on this report, would someone like to move that we receive the report for information? Shane and Sam, all those in favour? Contrary, carried. Report 2, page 12 to 15.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So this paper sets out some notes from the discussions which have been held with Ashburton District Council and with Napier City Council. You'll recall that the committee sought to get some views from other councils that have been through a process of reviewing their representation system and have made changes, particularly around the questions of ward versus at large, and in terms of the number of elected members per population ratio. We made approaches to Ashburton, to Napier and to Nelson. We haven't yet been able to find a time to connect with Nelson, but we may be able to gather information from them through other means. But we set up the meetings with Ashburton and Napier some of the members of the committee were able to attend, but the meetings were recorded, and those recordings are available for anybody that would like to watch those offline. Really the notes are set out for, again, for discussion and really to gain some insight from the process, the learnings and the outcomes and how those changes are now working. And I thought some really interesting discussions and some good insights, both from officers who were involved in developing the process for those changes, but also, and in particular, from the elected members who have been through and have had some history with those councils, looking at what were the issues and the challenges and how those systems are now working for both of them. So in the case of Napier City Council, it's noted there on page 14 that they've made a number of changes to basis of election over the years, but most recently in 2019 moved from electing on a mixed basis, which was some at large and some by ward, back to a ward only basis. Findings there were that the workload on the mixed basis was seen as higher for councillors elected by ward compared to those elected at large. The ward issues often came to an at-large councillor were often pushed to the ward councillor to deal with. With less members being elected by ward, new councillors at times felt isolated and not supported, and it was felt that for candidates elected at large, name recognition was required to get elected rather than connection with the community. But in terms of the ward basis, they saw benefits as being greater connection, lower cost, improved diversity, which was a significant plus for a number of those who commented, and some analysis indicated that there was a higher number of nominations received and a higher voter turnout, which was interesting in the case of Napier. Page 15 just sets out some findings from the discussion with Ashburton during 29. It went through the representation review process and changed its number of elected members from 12 down to 9. So, and again, they commented that one of the reasons for that was their ratio of elected members to population was quite low compared to other councils. There was early engagement with ratepayers, but there was still some criticism that changes had not been well signalled and that the options given for consideration were too limited. And I think that points to the comments that have been made this morning about the need for good and clear and open engagement. Reflecting on the change now at this stage, the council believes it's been positive. The change has been good for the overall democratic process. Councillors are connecting with people, and it's felt that meetings were now running more smoothly, democratic process being more efficient. And again, just reminding us about that need to communicate early and often with ratepayers and to ensure the process was well planned and resourced. But those of you that were part of those discussions or that have had an opportunity to review the content may well have some comments and observations.
Firstly, I'd like to apologise to Councillor Miller for being omitted off the invitation to those Zoom meetings. That was unfortunate, and we apologise for that. Napier over time has actually transitioned from completely at large to a ward basis, and I found that really interesting. That one of the telling comments to me was that they found at large tended to favour candidates either with great name recognition or great funding. That it didn't encourage a diversity of representation, as Mr. Hill has said. That going back to by ward, completely by ward, they get a better diversity of representation for the residents. They had some wards who were, how to phrase this, economically challenged compared to other wards, and that they felt that at large didn't end up with representatives from those communities because in part of the cost and the name recognition issues. Also, the comment was that the ward councillors, particularly the ward councillors where there was a single councillor in the ward, found the workload higher, and it was more difficult, as they said that they had all the award issues pushed to them by other councillors and presumably residents choosing to contact the ward councillor. That could be counteracted if councillors acted collegially and were able to feel comfortable in taking on representation outside of the areas, but it was interesting feedback that being a single councillor in a ward can be very isolating, very lonely, very challenging, particularly if you're a new councillor in that ward. So that was, I found, useful feedback. Ashburton, they also adjusted their ward boundaries, bringing some areas into the Ashburton ward that were not necessarily geographically obviously linked, but they were the more urban areas into that ward, and reducing their councillor numbers. I think they very helpfully pointed out to us early and clear communication is important when you're making changes, because while they thought they had, clearly it hadn't reached the community as well as they thought, and that a number of submissions were driven by that lack of understanding. So I think the signal for us is to go out early with explaining why we have to change, even if perhaps before we're in the situation of saying what the changes will be. But with information in this report, in this agenda, we can go out to the community and say we are doing this process because we have had growth that means we're outside the legislative norms, and we will have to choose a different system. And the system could be election at large, it could be fewer councillors, different ward structure, but start preparing our community to understand that the status quo cannot stand, that we cannot continue with 11 councillors in our 4 wards because we're outside of the legislative framework, and start that journey. It's going to be challenged because next year we have a whole bunch of consultation coming up with our community, and slotting this in is going to be challenging. But I think each of us and the rest of council can take that challenge to our communities, and as has been discussed, ask them, what do they feel well represented today? Do they feel better represented with fewer or more councillors, fewer or more wards? What structure suits them? Because ultimately it is their system.
Yeah, I'll just say thanks for setting up the meetings. I think there was one of the requests at the last meeting to connect with those that are doing things differently than we are, and I sat on for the Ashburton meeting, and the comments that we received I think were helpful to frame up some of the things we need to think about ahead of time. So yeah, I'm happy to move the report.
Yeah, look, I'm disappointed. I've made no secret I'm disappointed I didn't get to go to those meetings, because I think they would have been invaluable. But having read, particularly, I think Ashburton done a great job of actually looking backwards, which sometimes we don't do it at all. We have projects and don't review them. But they have been quite in depth and actually analysed what worked well and what didn't work well. And they've made some really good points that we could take on board for our consultation, I think, here about, they even talked about, should there be a community representative on this committee? It seems like an obvious sort of thing, doesn't it? But maybe we're not allowed to do that. But I just feel we're not getting any feedback from the community at all about how they see the representation they receive now. I've particularly taken on Councillor Morton's view, and I hadn't really drilled down that far, but the COVID situation where we did largely transition to a digital environment just proved that distance is not a millstone to representation, because with Zoom and all these things now, you can have pretty effective representation. So I take that point on board. So, but certainly, one of the key things I took out of these documents was to bring the rest of the council along with us, because we've got a group of councillors who are not here today who could be perceived that they're getting tugged in a direction they won't want to go, and particularly not predetermining too soon in the process what your outcome might be. So.
Yep, got it. My apologies too. I wasn't able to attend any of the with the other councils. In terms of diversity, was there discussions with each of the city councils around iwi or hapu engagement?
I believe there was. I have to go back and look at my notes, but it was certainly part of the process in both cases.
Thank you. And I think, as Grant mentioned, community committees, I think, if we're a true reflection of democracy within our society, I think then we need to look at iwi and hapu engagement and for them to be a part of the discussions moving forward as a part of this council. Thank you.
So Mark, just one thing I didn't say is that just reflecting on what we are compared to other councils, particularly Christchurch or one of the larger urban councils, a lot of the grunt work that's done on a day-to-day basis is done by community boards out in the community. So the elected representatives are more at a strategic level or governance level, where we're in effect trying to be a community board as well as a council. So I guess we need to sort of think about, in the Melbourne situation, would be maybe understanding what that might mean for our community boards, and what the effectiveness has been, and whether you go to the model like we have in Springs and Ellesmere, where the councillors do everything, or whether you have the model like Melbourne, where there's another layer of grunt underneath it.
Thank you, Grant. We have, in previous representation reviews, floated for community boards and fewer councillors, and pretty soundly the community have turned that down every time. It is yet again one of the models that could be offered this time. We have coming up on council's agenda the restructure of the community committee structures, and that's kind of ties in with this, because what is the future of our community committee structures then leads into what is our representation review structure, to effectively give our communities a voice in their governance. So there are many work streams that overlap in this. So it could be that we conclude that in the models that we offer the community. Last time I think we offered them 2 or 3 different models of structure for them to choose, and they chose one. It was appealed as we disestablished the Untitled Community Board. That appeal was lost. Council's proposal was supported. So it is an option to come back to them and say, is some kind of ward structure, which is generally a community board, a way of doing it.
So, Mr. Chair, even in this brief meeting today, we seem to have floated a lot of ideas, which is, I suppose, is the purpose of this meeting. But are you going to develop, or your team going to develop a clear work program, so we actually have some definition of what we're trying to achieve here and the timelines and work? And that was one of the things of Ashburton, as they said, look, you really want a really structured work program that does deliver an outcome. Have we got that? I mean, we've got a timeline, but I'm not sure we've got a work program.
We have a meeting time frame. I think the call for a workshop, probably, I guess, in February, once we have the mesh block numbers, is a potentially useful call that I would have to discuss with Mr. Hill and our chief executive to see if we can fit that in at some point, where we can look at those population figures and what they mean, but also possibly have a wider opportunity to kick some ideas around about what might be effective representation. So it's useful to call for that now in either February or March timeframe. I think we have to make that opportunity to have a wide-ranging discussion as to what are the potential options and how might they look, so we can bring that back. And it ties in with going out to pre-consultation with the community.
Just that if the logical version of what happens at a community committees, you might not have community committees to go to get feedback from, and the ones that are still existing might be quite negative towards council. So just some challenges there.
Yes, it may be a more focus group based consultation if we're going to meet with specific groups of individuals. I'm sure we all could nominate some in our community who might be useful to have that level of consultation with. But I'll have this discussion in the next day or so as to how this might look, and we'll try to add at least an extra workshop in that time frame if we can find an opportunity to allow us to explore these things. Any other discussion on this report? There being no further business on the agenda, I will declare the meeting closed at 9:11. Our next meeting is I'll just see if I can find it in my calendar. It's
Yeah, I believe it's early February. 27th of Jan. Okay. Yeah.
and so there may be an opportunity around that time to have some workshop, depending on what's available. The meeting's currently scheduled from 3 to 4 on the Wednesday afternoon. Would members be available for a longer period if we were to do a workshop as well on that day?
Yeah, more than an hour is fine.
So that 27th, Mr. Chairman, which is not a council meeting.
So in the morning, there's a start-up day for councillors with senior staff, and then in the afternoon, there's a representation review meeting scheduled.
Just yes, on my calendar, so obviously it's been seen. Or maybe my calendar. What's there?
Yeah.
It's showing a council meeting. Could I ask the secretary just to flip me a entry into the calendar so.
Yeah. Thank you. If we were to have this potentially a workshop, because there may not be terribly much to discuss in a formal meeting, but if we were to say this meeting could run till say 5 p.m, would members that be okay?
Absolutely.
Right. Thank you. Meeting closed 9:13.